coming here today. He's father of the Amiga, and he's going to give us something about the history of the machine. We're looking forward to next year's meeting, October 13th, in 1990. Same place, same station. Without further ado, Mr. Jay Miner.
Good morning. Thank you all for inviting me here. It was Jack, and it's a pleasure to be here in Dallas. I was one of the founders of the original Amiga Corporation in Santa Clara. That was in 1982. I was vice president of engineering, and Dave Morris was our president. We brought him out from back east to be the president, and we set up the company there in some little offices. And my history in computers goes back to Atari. I learned most of my video work at Atari. I started with Atari in 1975 when they were in a very small building out in Los Gatos. And I designed the chips that are in the 2600 video game machine. Then I went on to design the chips that were in the 400, 800 computer series. In fact, I was in charge of that whole design, the 400, 800 computer for Atari. And in 1979, I got fed up with Atari. They were had changed hands a couple of times by the original people were no longer there, and they weren't being responsive anymore. So I and a lot of other people left Atari. I went to work for a small pacemaker company that designed implantable pacemaker computer chips in 1979, and stayed there for 2 years. One day, a guy from that I used to work for me at Atari called me up and said, "Jay, I want to start a company." And I said, "Well, I've got this good job. I don't want to leave it. But I know someone that knows a lot of people with money." So I introduced him to my boss, who knew some people in Texas here. In fact, some people down on the Gulf Coast. I forget the name of that little town now. Freeport. Down in Freeport, had a lot of money, wanted to start a video games company. So I introduced them together, and they hit it off really good. Decided to start a business and made up a business plan. I brought Dave Morris back from back east to be the company president. And this guy that was agitating all this, his name was Larry Kaplan. He was really the original founder of the Amiga, if you think of it that way. Although at that time it wasn't called Amiga Corporation, it was called Hi-Toro. We changed the name later on. Anyway, how I got into it, this guy, Larry Kaplan, things weren't going fast enough for him. The company wasn't starting fast enough. So he quit and left. And there we were with a company with a business plan, investors to finance it, the company president, and that was it. And offices on Santa Clara, and nothing else. So they asked me if I would come on board and be the VP of engineering and spark the thing, which I did. In retrospect, I'm glad I did. So we started in these little offices in Santa Clara, and I started designing the chips, and I hired about half a dozen other engineers and programmers to help me. And they in turn hired more people. Did you ever see that Walt Disney movie called Fantasia, where Mickey Mouse is the sorcerer's apprentice, and he keeps getting these brooms to help him carry water? And pretty soon you can't stop them. The brooms are hiring more brooms, and there's so much water, it's a flood. That's the way I feel now. I started this thing, and nobody can stop it now. It's amazing. Anyway, we designed the chips. It took about 6 months. A lot of people are very interested in why the Amiga ended up like it is in terms of the amount of memory and so forth. Well, the investors wanted a video games machine. They wanted something that would sell in the neighborhood of $250. And so therefore our president wanted the same thing because he was very close with the investors. I personally wanted a very expandable, low cost, but expandable, very expandable home computer that could do really good flight simulators. I was hooked on flight simulators. A friend of mine worked at Link Corporation, and he took me over there and showed me all of the big flight simulators that they have for the military. I said, "Oh God, I've got to have one of these at home. Even if I have to design my own, I've got to have one of these at home." So that was one of the first requirements of the Amiga, was my desire for a flight simulator. And I wanted to be able to run all kinds of programs on it, so I wanted it to be general purpose. That's why the Amiga eventually, Amiga 1000, ended up with an expansion port on the side. I had to fight Commodore for that, by the way. It's getting ahead of the story a little bit, but after we became part of Commodore, they wanted to take that expansion port off the side of the machine, and I put my job on the line and said, we've got to have the expansion port. And it stayed. I was surprised. I expected to lose my job. Anyway, we took the machine in its original form, which was a bunch of these big breadboard cards, all stacked vertically. There was a breadboard for each of the 3 custom chips that are in the Amiga. And I want to get into a little bit what's in those custom chips too in a minute. But these 3 big breadboards we took to the CES show in Las Vegas. And we had to send 2 technicians along with it to keep it working because every once in a while a wire would fall off. On the back of each one of these boards is 3,000 of these little wires with wire wraps on each end. And one would fall off and you didn't know where it came from. These technicians knew that machine so well, they could go in and inside of 5 minutes with an oscilloscope, they could say, there's where the wire goes, and put it back on and we'd be working again. It was really wonderful. And we sent some software people to the show in Las Vegas too. The software people were behind the counter writing the demo software as they were demoing it on the floor. They were up all night when the convention was closed. They were up all night writing the Boing Ball demo you've seen probably, the bouncing red and white soccer ball, which is the Amiga trademark for those of you that aren't, or used to be the Amiga trademark. Now they've got this little dash thing, which is silly. Anyway, I'm digressing. Both Commodore and Atari saw us at the show and kind of liked us. Atari, in fact, entered into negotiations with us about that time to use our chips in their computers. We had a letter of agreement from them that they would give us a certain amount of money to keep us from going into bankruptcy. We were very close to bankruptcy at that point in time. This was about 83, I guess it was, 83, 84 in that time frame. We had run out of money. I had mortgaged my house up to here in order to meet the payroll. And Atari came along and loaned us some money to keep us from going bankrupt while we were negotiating for this agreement to put, licensing agreement to put our chips in their computer. Well, as soon as Atari changed hands, was sold again, negotiations just stopped. And we were left holding the bag. If we didn't pay Atari back the money, they would own the chips and we would have nothing. So luckily about that point, Commodore came along and said, hey, you've got a great chipset, we want the computer. And so they bought us lock, stock, and barrel. We sold them all the stock and became Commodore employees in a sense. Although we were a separate division, and I was still vice president of that separate division. They brought in a new president from Apple, a guy named Rick Geiger, where they moved us into these fancy new buildings out in Los Gatos, where the Amiga was actually finally put together for production engineering. And it became the machine that you know it now. I've skipped over a few little things. We'll have a question and answer session after a while. This is supposed to run about an hour, and I'm supposed to talk for about half an hour. Anyway, the machine became what it is today in terms of the package and everything, in spite of my efforts to get it to look more like an IBM with big card slots, because of the investors wanting a video game and something that looked like a video game. I said, no, it's got to look like a computer. And he said to me, my president said to me, well, what does a computer look like? I said, well, you've seen the ads for the IBM with Charlie Chaplin, haven't you? And he says, yeah. I said, well, that's what a computer should look like. But do they listen to me? No. They came out with, well, it's a nice little thing, the Amiga 1000 with the keyboard that slides underneath it, but it looks like a toy, you know. It isn't what people perceived of as a computer. In addition to that, Commodore would not put out the effort or the money to do with the regular software people like Microsoft and Borland, et cetera, really good software to try and compete with IBM. They didn't want to compete with IBM. I really believe that. They thought they had a games machine, and they didn't realize what they had on their hands. I've been down on Commodore about their ads for so long that I think they're getting tired of hearing me say this, but they don't show Amiga, they don't do any comparative advertising at all. And I think that's criminal, because if you compare the Amiga to the IBM and the Amiga to the Macintosh, we've got so much more power and speed. I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but the Amiga has inside of it 2 buses. It's got what's called the chip memory bus. And that chip memory bus can be used by the custom chips to actually put the display up on the screen, to move things around on the screen. It's got coprocessors in it, several coprocessors that can operate on the display independent of the main processor. One of them is called the blitter, which can move big areas of the screen around very quickly. In addition to that memory bus that the chip coprocessors run out of, there's the main memory bus that the 68,000 runs out of. The 68,000 can also talk to the display chip memory, but it doesn't have to. So the 68,000 can be running its own program in its own memory bus at the same time as all of this display work is going on without having the processor do any of the display fetching or moves. So this gives the Amiga a lot more speed and power than the other machines. In addition to that, and software-wise, we're kind of the best of both worlds. We've got the command line interface of the IBM world, and we've got the really excellent windowing icon mouse-driven system of the Macintosh world. So that, and personally, I find that on my machine, I use it about 50% of the time I'm using the command line interface, and about 50% of the time I'm using the mouse. And that seems to work about the best for me. So we do have a superior machine. Getting back to what I was saying, but there's no ads comparing these features or showing these features. There's no ads describing the blitter. There's no ads describing why our audio is superior to anybody else's audio. We've got 4 channels of stereo sound. Other machines talk about 8 voices or 16 voices. Do you know what that means, a voice? It means a single sine wave. It doesn't mean a complex waveform. It means a single sine wave. We call that a voice. We can have a flute on one channel, a harpsichord on another channel, and drums or cymbals on another channel. And each one of those would occupy about 16 voices, at least all by itself, on another computer. So if anybody from Commodore is here, we really need some comparative advertising and some advertising that shows things like MaxiPlan, which is a version of 1.2.3 on the Amiga that imports 1.2.3 files from the IBM if you need to, and puts them back out again. But it also has many features that the IBM does not have in terms of spreadsheets for business work. And the list can go, I could go on and on for hours about the software on the Amiga that is the equivalent to the other software, but easier to use with better graphics and sound. Anyway, I digress again. Commodore bought us, moved us out to Los Gatos. I became a company president, or a division manager, actually, is what it is, because we were part of Commodore at that time, Commodore Amiga in Los Gatos. Atari sued the heck out of us because they said that the chips were too similar to the 400 and 800, which they weren't, but they were mad at Commodore for for bailing us out of the noose that Atari thought they had us in. So Atari and Commodore had this big feud going, which resulted in lawsuits against poor little Amiga. And it took me quite a while to defend those lawsuits. I had to get up in court and tell them why the chips were not the same, and I had not violated any patents from Atari when I designed the chips. We ran in Los Gatos quite well for a couple of years, from 84 to 86, and then Commodore found themselves in really big financial trouble. The 64, for some reason, was not selling well. Of course, they weren't advertising it very much either then. Plus, when Tramiel left Commodore, he left a lot of unusable, unsaleable inventory that was not written off until that point in time. So all of a sudden, it looked like Commodore was on the edge, and the bankers were on Commodore's neck. So Commodore tried to cut back everywhere. They cut back in Westchester, they cut back in Germany, and they cut back in Los Gatos. Well, 70% cut in personnel at Westchester still left thousands of people. 70% cut in Los Gatos at Fort Little Amiga left about 5 of us. So Amiga in Los Gatos just kind of petered out. We didn't have enough people to make it sustaining anymore. We didn't have enough projects to make it sustaining, and people started leaving at that point. And Commodore closed it down, moved all the furniture back east to Westchester, and kind of put me out to pasture, so to speak. That's a very brief, short history of the Amiga. If there's any questions, can anybody think of something that I left out that they'd like to know about? Yes, you.
How does the German end of it kind of tie into all this?
Commodore had a German engineering division for a long time. They were the ones that did the original sidecar. Did you hear about the Amiga sidecar? Then they went on to do the first version of the 2000. And then I understand it was redone later in Westchester. It's become the 2000 we have now.
Is there anything that you would have done differently to the Amiga before it was released that you haven't already told us about?
Well, there's lots of things that I would have wished I could have done differently that I couldn't at the time. Hindsight is always perfect. In this case, foresight was pretty good too, except that you've got to compromise. Engineering is the art of compromise. The only thing that I really wouldn't compromise on at all was that expansion port on the 1000. I had to compromise on the shape of the machine. I had to compromise on the memory requirements. I would have put more memory into it in the beginning. 512K as a bare minimum with empty slots up to about 2 megabytes. I mean, 512K would have made a lot of sense in that first Amiga 1000. Also, I probably, in hindsight, I would have designed it with pixel graphics instead of bitplane graphics. They're a little more standard and versatile now, it turns out. The bitplane graphics allow you to move data around much faster because you have less data to move if you have very few bits per pixel, which was the case in the 64 and the early Amiga. We worked mostly with 4-bit planes, 5-bit planes, 3-bit planes, which means 4 or 5 bits of information defining each pixel. But they were arranged in a bitplane fashion, so we could move 16 of those bits at a time with the computer, rather than moving 3 or 4 bits at a time if they were pixel oriented. Well, now with memory the way it is and computer designs the way they are, moving 16 bits of a single pixel to define a single pixel is more efficient in terms of high color quality and lots of color definitions. So I would have, in hindsight, I would have done that differently. I would definitely have worked harder to get Commodore to support the developers, especially people like Microsoft and Borland. And I kind of sat back and didn't do as much as I should have along those lines. Question down here.
Yeah. Doesn't seem to me that the multitasking abilities of the Amiga started off as being something that would have to do with a game machine. Where did that?
There was a fellow we hired. The first software guy we hired was named Bob Paraso. He was kind of a hippie type with a long ponytail and a real nice guy. He hired the rest of the guys, and some of the guys were from Tandem. Tandem Computers is where Bob Paraso came from, and he was really into multitasking. So it was Bob Paraso's push that gave us multitasking. That combined with the software from England, the Tripos software that was done, the first multitasking operating system that Amiga got. And then it got refined a little bit, but not too much. That was our operating system, and how we got that was a default. They were looking at another system, I forget if it was OS 9 or what it was, but there was some other multitasking operating system that had some legal problems involving our use of it. And at the last minute, that fell through, and we had to find another one really quick. Well, they ran into Tim King from England, who had this operating system that we have now, or at least the basic part, beginning and building blocks of this operating system that we have now, and let him go to it. And I think it was a good decision because now I think we've got a better operating system than we would have if we'd gone with the others. Yes?
What's the history behind the hold and modify mode creation of it?
Oh, that was my baby. I was talking about the fellow from Singer Link that showed me the flight simulators, and I asked him how they worked, and he was telling me about these huge line buffers they have, several of them, each one having 64 bits deep. Well, each one of those pixels on the screen is represented by one of these line buffer registers, 64 bits deep, and there was something like 1,500 of them across the screen. And you have to have 2 of those for line buffering purposes. Well, what that line buffer did with 64 bits in each pixel location across a single horizontal line was to define the starting color of a field. But then in that would be a thing that said, don't use the same color, but start with that color and increase the intensity a little bit, or increase the hue, or change the saturation, luminance. The 3 values, hue, saturation, and luminance, were the three values that they were using in these flight simulators. And it happened to be that we were working with NTSC television, and the NTSC television signal generating circuits were on the chip at that time, on the Amiga Magnus chip. So I said, well, we can do the same thing. All we have to have is a register to hold the last pixel value of the color and change either the hue, saturation, or luminance fields of it, depending on the next bit. Only change one of those fields, which means we only have to change 4 of the bits instead of 12 of them. So it's a holdover from that and from the NTSC being on the chip, being able to change the hue, the color very gradually over a field on the screen with very small amount of information. But when we took the NTSC generating circuits off the chip in order to make room for more RGB circuits, I wanted to take the hold and modify out of there because it was, in my opinion, at that time, it was really only usable for hue, saturation, and intensity. RGB, who wants to hold the red while you change the blue and the green, right? Or who wants to hold the green while you change the red and the blue? But the guy that was doing the actual drawing of the chip layout itself said, if we take that off, it's going to leave a hole in the middle of the chip. We don't have time to re-lay out the whole chip to take advantage of that hole. So let's just leave it in, and if nobody uses it, that's fine. And in hindsight, that's another thing. In hindsight, I would have made hold and modify a little bit better, put in more bit planes for it and so forth, and looking forward to the future. But I didn't think it was going to be used at all. Was I ever amazed when the first use was made of hold and modify, in terms of just showing pictures that have been pre-digitized? I said, oh my God, well, that's great, but they'll never make a drawing program out of it. I spoken like a true hardware person. The software programs now like DigiPaint 3 that do actual drawing with hold and modify just knock my socks off. I can't imagine how they can do things like that with this machine. But it makes me glad that that chip artist layout person said no can do as far as the taking that hold and modify out of there. Does that answer your question? If anything else anybody can think of, back there in the back.
Yeah. The 4,026 color palette limiting the Amiga. I heard rumors about a new graphics board coming out in 2000. If that's true, what will that do? Do you have any?
I hear the same rumors, and I can only guess because I haven't seen the board or read any specs on it or anything. But I hear it's a TI chip on there. Is that the one you're talking about? Yeah, that will probably be lots of colors and give us a better competitive position in terms of the number of total colors on the screen.
What type of resolution? I heard it has to be resolution around 1024 by 1024.
I hear that too, yes, but you can bet your boots it's going to be a lot slower. Because anytime you get more colors and more resolution, and you don't have something that the blitter can work into and move stuff around really fast, the processor has to get in there and move it in between pixels on the screen.
We're not going to process 68 million.
Faster processor would speed things up, definitely. But in the display area, not so much. In the display area, it's more memory bandwidth and how fast can you suck the data out of the memory to get it to the display. And what would help there, and I think there are plans for this, I'm sure, at Commodore, is to use video RAM to drive some of these new displays. So there's going to be all kinds of new displays in the future. Yes, down here.
At DEFCON, they had the U-Lore graphic card on 2000 with the TI chip, and that has memory on it, and it was fast.
Was it? Well,
Yeah.
good. Did they actually move things around on the screen in animation?
Yeah, they did the boxes things.
Because that's what I meant by fast, is moving things around on the screen.
Right, and one of the interesting things, you can put patterns in the chip. And instead of, normal box, you got colors, well, they had different patterns in it, moving around really fast. At about 1,000 byte. And they had about a megabyte on it. It's going to be expensive though.
Most of the higher resolution color displays on machines like the Mac and so forth have a frame buffer that allows them to be that way. And the pipeline into that frame buffer is very narrow and slow, and you can't move stuff around very fast in animation. And I had assumed that the display chip you're talking about would be the same way. But Haven't seen it yet. Looking forward to it. I'll probably buy one myself. I bought a flicker fixer. That's a good product. It fills in all these lines in between the lines for you. Even on low resolution, it looks great. It makes low resolution look like a painted picture. Yes, back there.
How many Amigas are in the United States and worldwide, and what do they project? Do they have any idea what it would be to versus something else?
I can only go by what Commodore says, and they claim that there's a million Amigas out there now.
That worldwide?
I think that's worldwide.
And what's in the States?
What's in the States?
Yeah.
Less than half of that. Europe is a big market for the Amiga. I predict that the sales are going to continue to go up, especially with advertising like this and the 500. There's going to be a certain audience there that this advertising will appeal to. And they'll sell quite a few 500s over the next year or two into that market. But that market's kind of going to, I don't think it's a sustaining market. I think, IBM and Apple with their type of advertising that they do is much more of a sustained market. There was another guy right behind him that was trying to get in before Jeanette. Just back there?
Okay. In the multitasking, it's possible for one task to integrate adversely with other tasks and sort of bring the whole machine down. Do they plan to fix that in the future releases of the operating system?
The Unix is supposed to fix that.
No, so the Unix is coming.
Unix will have oh yes, Unix is definitely coming. They will have a good memory management, hardware memory management system on Unix with the 68030. And
What, 60 or 30?
well, the 68030 has a built-in memory management unit, and I think that's the way they're going. I can't speak for Commodore because they used to tell me stuff, but when they found out what a big mouth I have, they don't tell me anything anymore. But the 30 will have memory management.
If you were designing the Amiga today, what hardware capabilities would you build in?
IBM has been trying to find that out from me. They wanted me to go to at least some people that work with them wanted me to go to a IBM workshop and give them all my ideas for about a week's worth of salary. And I said, that's crazy. Why should I tell everybody, what's in my head about the next generation when, especially for a week's worth of salary? And for a plane ticket to Dallas, it's even crazier.
What are you doing?
Well, I'm doing a lot of playing with my computer at home. I've been retired for a couple of years. I was quite sick for about a year there. I came down with complete kidney failure. And I was in the hospital, and I was on one of those dialysis machines for almost a year. And then my sister graciously donated one of her kidneys to me. And I had a kidney transplant. That was about a year ago now. And it's taken me the last year to really get back into the swing of things. I've just taken a job at a little pacemaker company called Venturetex out in Sunnyvale, designing pacemakers again. I did that once before. Well, I guess that about wraps it up then. I want to thank you for listening to me, taking the time to come here. Thank you.